In the winter of 1980, the most talked-about woman of the 20th century lay in a darkened Paris bedroom, unable to speak and fed through tubes, while downstairs a stranger she had never chosen was quietly deciding the fate of everything she owned. If this account has been useful, subscribing costs nothing, and more stories like this one are queued. The bell notification means you will see them. You have heard she cost a king his throne. You have almost certainly never been told what it cost her. The house sat behind high iron gates on the Bois de Boulogne, on the western edge of Paris, a grand villa most of the neighbourhood barely knew was occupied. The shutters stayed drawn, morning and night. For years she had hardly left it. Inside, nurses kept watch outside a single bedroom and let almost no one pass the door. Biographers who later pieced the scene together found something stranger than a rich old woman dying in comfort. Even her closest surviving friends were turned away. Women who had known her for 40 years telephoned and were told no. They came in person, stood at the gate, and were sent back down the drive. She had once filled the front page of every newspaper on 2 continents at the same time. Reporters had once fought each other for a single photograph of her face. Now she lay silent in a room the world was no longer permitted to enter, and the world had, more or less, agreed to forget she was still alive. She lost everything twice, once in the full glare of history, in a story you think you already know, and once more here, in the dark, in silence, with someone standing over her who was not family, not a friend, and not anyone she would ever have chosen. This is the story of both times, and of who was standing over her the second. Start with the most unlikely part of all of it, because none of what followed should ever have happened to a woman like her. She was not born to any of this. She came into the world as Bessie Wallace Warfield in Baltimore, in the American South, into a family with an old respectable name and almost no money to go with it. Her father died when she was a baby. She grew up watching relatives pay her school fees. There was no title anywhere near her, no fortune, no drop of royal blood on either side of the ocean. By the time the British public first heard her name, she had already been married once and divorced, and had married a second time. A twice-married American divorcee from Baltimore. On paper, she was the least likely person alive to move a British throne so much as an inch. She moved it clean off its foundations. She met him at a country party in 1931 in the English countryside, among the sort of people who owned the houses she was only ever visiting. Edward, Prince of Wales, heir to the British throne and to an empire that reached around the planet, the most eligible bachelor in the world, and by every account a restless, charming, deeply bored one. What happened between them was not a slow thing. Friends said the pull was there almost at once, and then, over the next few years, it became total, all-consuming, the single organising fact of his life. Within 5 years the old king was dead, and Edward was King Edward VIII, and by then the court around him was frightened. Private secretaries and government ministers watched the way he behaved when she was in the room and did not like what they saw. He could not settle to his state papers. He rearranged the whole shape of his days around her moods. Whatever it was she had, and the men in grey suits loathed her for it, no adviser and no argument could loosen her grip on the king. And a king could not simply marry whoever he pleased. Edward was not only head of state, he was the head of the Church of England, and the Church did not remarry the divorced while a former husband still lived. Wallis had 2 of those. The Prime Minister told him plainly that the country would never accept her as Queen. The government warned it would resign rather than allow it. The whole grey machinery of the British establishment closed ranks against the match and expected, as it always had, that the king would bend. He did not bend. Hold that image of the sealed room, because everything that follows is the story of how she ended up in it. Because in December 1936, Edward VIII did the one thing no British monarch had ever done. He gave up the throne, not forced out by a war, not toppled by a scandal of state, but stepping down on purpose, for a single reason: to marry her. Think for a moment about the size of what sat on that table, the crown of Great Britain, an empire that covered close to a quarter of the land on earth, the obedience of hundreds of millions of subjects who had been taught to see the king as almost sacred. 1,000 years of the oldest continuous monarchy in Europe resting on his shoulders. He weighed all of that against one divorced woman from Baltimore, and he chose the woman. He remains the only British king who ever surrendered the throne for love. He sat down at a microphone, his voice steady, and told the entire empire, live, that he had found it impossible to carry the burden without the woman he loved beside him. Then he stood up a private citizen, a former king before the crown had ever touched his head. And when it was done, the anger did not land on him. It landed on her. He became the romantic king who gave up everything for love, half tragic, half forgiven. She became the foreigner who had stolen him from his people. The letters that arrived at their door called her worse than anything a newspaper would print. In the public mind, she was fixed permanently as the woman who had broken the monarchy, and that verdict would follow her into every room she entered for the rest of her life. Now, put yourself where she stood. Staff who served the couple in the years afterward described over and over the deal she believed she had made, and in her own head it was a simple, fair one. She had taken on the most hated role in the English-speaking world. She had let a king throw away a kingdom for her, and she would carry the blame for it forever. In return, she expected 3 things, and only 3. A husband who worshipped her completely and for good, a grand life to go with him, glittering, comfortable, spent among the most interesting people alive, and security. Real, unshakable security for all the long years still ahead of her. A devoted man, a golden exile, a safe old age. That was the bargain. That, she was certain, was what she had won the day a king gave up his crown, rather than lose her. Remember what she had already handed over to get there. She had crossed an ocean and left her own country behind. She had given the whole world a reason to despise her. She had accepted that she could never go home to Baltimore as anything but the woman from the headlines. She had paid in full before the marriage even began. The bargain was supposed to be worth every bit of it. She got the first part. The husband was hers, and he stayed hers. Almost everything else was about to be taken back from her, piece by people who had never wanted her anywhere near them. The taking began almost at once. When Edward abdicated, the crown passed straight to his younger brother, a shy man with a bad stutter who became King George VI. And it was George VI who made the very first cut, and made it deliberately. He gave his elder brother a new title, Duke of Windsor, so that Edward would keep his standing as a royal duke. But when the moment came to decide what Wallis would be, the new king drew a cold, hard line. She could be called the Duchess of Windsor. She would never be granted the style Her Royal Highness. Those words were held back on purpose, 3 letters kept just out of her reach, and the decision was written directly into the letters patent, the formal legal document that set out exactly who in the family counted and who did not. It was a wall built out of paperwork, and it never came down. On the day the couple finally married, in 1937, At a rented chateau in the French countryside, the Duke of Windsor could be addressed as a Royal Highness, and the woman he was marrying could not. Aides who spent years at his side said that single snub wounded him every day he lived. He wrote letters about it. He raised it with prime ministers. He never once got it reversed. And around the wedding itself, the family made its feelings just as plain, simply by staying away. Not one working member of the British royal family attended. His own mother did not come. His brothers did not come. The most famous couple on the planet were married in a borrowed house, in front of a small scatter of guests, with the entire institution the groom had been born into, standing pointedly on the far side of the channel. And the withheld style was the proof, out in the open, of what all of that meant. A woman who was not Her Royal Highness was a woman no one was obliged to bow or curtsy to. So every time the two of them walked into a room together, a small silent test played out, guest by guest. Some dipped, some very deliberately did not. The palace had ruled, in writing and forever, on exactly how little of the royal world she would ever be allowed to touch, and the style was only the first item on a very long list. So they turned outward, away from the country that had shut its door, into a life with no real address of their own. Cut off from Britain, cut off from the family, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor became something the world had never quite seen before, permanent guests, beautiful, famous faces at other people's dinner tables, the first names on every fashionable host's list, and the owners of nothing that was truly, securely theirs. She did not yet understand the shape of what was coming for her. She had her husband, and she had the glamour, and she still believed the third thing, the security, the safe old age, was hers by right and waiting at the end of the road. She had no idea that the cruelest part of the whole bargain was being held in reserve, saved for the years when she would be far too old and far too weak to fight a single moment of it. For the next 36 years, Wallis Simpson would live as a guest at other people's tables, never once invited home. The woman who had cost a king his crown, welcomed everywhere and belonging nowhere, and the invitations were about to start thinning. They lived out of trunks, a couple with the manners of a court and no court left to hold them, moving on a fixed circuit between Paris, New York and the Riviera, always arriving, always leaving. Staff who handled the packing said the luggage went ahead first, stacked on the quay in the grey morning before the Duke and Duchess ever came down the gangway. Dozens of monogrammed cases carrying the wardrobe of a life that had nowhere to actually live. And here is the thing you have to understand about those years. From the outside, it looked like winning. The Riviera terrace at lunch, the sun on the water, the most photographed couple in the world laughing at somebody's table. But look at whose table it was. It was never theirs. They were the guests. The prize guests, the ones a hostess wanted at the head of her list because the name still sold, still made a dinner party the dinner party of the season. And a prize guest, however dazzling, goes home at the end of the night. They just never had a home to go to. They had houses. That is a different thing entirely. So they performed. Friends who watched them up close described it almost as an act the two of them kept running for an audience, a marriage staged for other people's evenings. The Duke would tell the same stories. The Duchess would hold the room. The guests would lean in. And underneath all of it ran a quiet, exhausting effort to be worth inviting again. Because when you belong nowhere, the invitation is the only proof you still exist. And there was one wound the Duke carried into every single room, and it never once healed. 3 letters, Her Royal Highness, the style his own family had refused to grant his wife. Inside their houses, the world worked the way he wanted it to. Aides recalled that the household staff were instructed to curtsy to the Duchess, to address her as Her Royal Highness, to treat her exactly as if the title had been given. Guests who knew the couple well were quietly expected to do the same. It was a small theatre of dignity the Duke built and rebuilt every day, in his own hallways, on his own terms. And then they crossed a border, and the theatre collapsed. Because the moment they stepped outside that private world, the law and the palace agreed on something they would not bend on. She was the Duchess of Windsor. She was not and would never be Her Royal Highness. Every official document, every formal introduction, every court circular reopened the snub. Aides said it gnawed at him. That is the word they used. Not anger exactly. A slow grinding hurt that came back the instant a footman somewhere failed to bow. The instant a form was filled out correctly and coldly. He had given up a throne for this woman, and his family would not give her 3 letters in return. He never stopped feeling the size of that refusal. And the scandal, the thing that had made them famous, would not fade the way scandals usually do. It followed them into every room. Friends described how the admiration always came shadowed by judgment. People wanted to meet them precisely because of what they had done, and people quietly condemned them for the very same reason. You could see it in a hostess's face, one friend said, the delight at having them, and just behind it, the sense that she was serving dinner to the woman who had broken the monarchy. And it got worse than gossip. There were the wartime suspicions, the ones that clung to the Duke and never quite washed off. The whispers about where his sympathies had really pointed in the darkest years, the meetings, the loose talk, the sense that a former King of Great Britain had drifted somewhere he should never have gone. Nothing was ever proven in the way a court would demand. But it did not need to be proven to do its work. It hung over him. It gave everyone who already disliked the marriage a respectable reason to keep the couple at a distance, and it turned every warm evening cool the moment the subject brushed too close. So picture the arithmetic of it, quietly working against them year after year. Every season, a few more doors that used to open now stayed shut, a hostess who died, a friend who tired of the drama or the debt, or the sameness of 2 people telling the old stories one more time. The circle did not collapse all at once. It contracted, slowly. The way a tide goes out so gradually you do not notice the water leaving until you look up and the boats are sitting on mud. And the invitations thinned. That is the plain word for it. The stack of cards on the hall table got shorter. The Riviera terraces filled with newer, younger names, and the Duke and Duchess of Windsor became imperceptibly the couple you had heard about rather than the couple you had to have. Friends recalled them growing smaller, lonelier, the guest list of their own lives shrinking, one crossed-out name at a time, until the great glittering marriage that had cost a crown was mostly just the 2 of them, in a house, waiting to be asked somewhere. And I want you to sit with that for a second, because it is the quiet horror underneath the whole glamorous legend. Ask yourself who is left standing beside you when the invitations stop and the one person who chose you is gone. That was the question closing in on Wallis Simpson through those years, and she almost certainly did not see it coming. She had made a bargain, remember, a devoted husband, a grand life, security for the years ahead. She thought she knew the shape of the deal. What the deal did not tell her was that the grand life had an expiry date written in other people's diaries, and that when the diaries stopped listing her, there would be almost no one left to notice. The 1960s tightened the screw. This is the decade where the glamour visibly ages into isolation. The old friends, The ones from the giddy pre-war years who had actually been there, who remembered the Prince of Wales and the American divorcée at the country party where it all began. Those friends started to die, one by one, and you cannot replace that kind of friend. A new acquaintance can admire you. Only an old one remembers you as a person, rather than a headline. As the funerals came and went, the couple lost not just company, but the last few people who saw them as human beings instead of a cautionary tale. And so the Paris house on the Bois de Boulogne became the centre of gravity, not one stop on a glittering circuit anymore. The place, increasingly the only place left. The shutters of that house, tall and shuttered against the street, start appearing in this part of the story the way a full stop appears at the end of a sentence. The world had been shrinking around them for 30 years, and now it had shrunk to a single address behind drawn shutters in a quiet corner of Paris. And then, in 1972, the one thing that had held all of it together broke. The Duke of Windsor died of cancer in that Paris house, with his wife beside him. Cancer of the throat wasting a once elegant man down to almost nothing in his final months. And whatever else you make of him, whatever you think of the abdication or the wartime rumours, understand what he was to her specifically. He was the one person on earth who had chosen her over everything, over a throne, over a family, over 1,000 years of an institution that told him not to. Every other door in her life had opened halfway and then, sooner or later, swung shut. His never had. For 36 years, whatever the world withdrew, he stayed. And now he was gone. And with him went the last reason the world had to keep any door open at all. He had been the ticket. He was the former king, the story, the reason a hostess made the call. Wallis alone was just the widow of a scandal. The magnetism that had dragged her into every room had always, in truth, been partly his. Without him, the pull was gone. And then something remarkable happened. Exactly once, the family that had held her at arm's length for 36 years opened the gates. Watch how the family opened the gates exactly once, and for how long. Because this is the moment people point to as proof of some late warmth, and it deserves a cold, careful look. The Duke was to be buried at Windsor, at St. George's Chapel, inside the walls, among his own. And the widow was invited to come, to fly to England, to stay under the palace roof, to stand at the funeral at Windsor as the wife of a king's son. After a lifetime of never being invited home, she was, for a matter of days, brought inside, and she arrived frail and disoriented. Observers who saw her that week described a woman already unsteady, dressed in black, a veil over her face, moving through Buckingham Palace and then Windsor, as if she were not entirely sure where she was or why. The most talked about woman in the world, reduced to a small bewildered figure, being gently steered from car to chapel, and the Queen received her. Elizabeth II received the Duchess of Windsor with what everyone who was there called a cold courtesy. And you need to hear both of those words, because they were doing precise work, courtesy, because the forms were kept perfectly. Nothing was said, nothing was refused, every protocol observed, and cold, because that was all there was. No warmth leaked through the correctness. The two women stood near each other at the ceremony, and yet visibly apart, the veiled widow and the sovereign, separated by a distance that decades of protocol had built, and one funeral was never going to close. Observers never forgot it. The outsider had been allowed briefly inside the walls, and then the funeral ended, and she was sent back across the channel, alone. The gates that had opened for a handful of days closed behind her exactly as they always had, and Wallis Simpson flew back to the shuttered house in Paris a widow now, with no husband to perform the marriage for, no invitations left to answer, and the 3 letters her husband had fought for still, even in his coffin, withheld. That was the family's welcome home. A few days at a funeral, and the door shut again. And that is when the house on the Bois de Boulogne truly began to close around her. Before I take you through those last sealed years, if these are the stories that pull at you, the ones the palace would rather you never heard, subscribing costs nothing, and there are more of them already on the way. The bell is the part that matters. Turn it on, and the next one finds you. Now, back to the house, and the doors starting to shut. Because without the Duke, Wallis had no one. That is not a figure of speech. The friends were dead or scattered. The family had done its duty and withdrawn. And she herself was slipping. Increasingly senile, the biographers would later record, her mind loosening its grip on the present and increasingly confined to a bed in a darkened room behind those permanent shutters. The grand marriage was over. The circuit was over. The performing was over. What remained was an old, wealthy, helpless woman in a big, quiet house with almost no one left who knew her, and fewer still who could reach her. A woman with a grand life, and no one left to protect her. Hold that image, because everything the rest of this story turns on grows out of that single fact. When the friends are gone, and the family is at a cold distance, and the mind is failing, and the doors are shuttered, the question is not whether someone will step into that emptiness. Someone always does. The question is who. And into that emptying house, quietly, without anyone quite marking the moment, someone had begun to take charge. Not a friend, not the family, a lawyer, a Frenchwoman with a sharp mind and a will of iron and complete unquestioned access to the failing Duchess and everything she still owned. The stranger who had been standing over Wallis Simpson the second time she lost everything now, had a name? Maître Suzanne Blum, her French lawyer, and one by one, from the inside, the doors of the Paris house were beginning to close, and the woman behind the shutters was already too far gone to notice whose hand was turning the locks. Her name was Maître Suzanne Blum, and by the late 1970s, she had turned every lock in that house on the Bois de Boulogne to face inward. Biographer Caroline Blackwood spent years trying to reach the woman behind those shutters, and the book she finally wrote about it reads less like a portrait of a duchess than the record of a siege. Blum controlled the access. She controlled the letters that came in and the letters that went out. She controlled every decision, large and small, in a life that had once filled the society pages of 3 continents. Nothing reached the Duchess that the lawyer did not permit. Nothing left her that the lawyer did not approve, and the Duchess, by then, could no longer lift a telephone to object to any of it. Blum was not a young woman herself. She was a lawyer in her 90s, sharp, formal, and utterly certain she was in the right. She guarded her client with an intensity that unsettled everyone who came near it. Writers who asked questions were met with the threat of a lawsuit. Blackwood described being received by an old woman who defended the Duchess's honour with the ferocity of a lover, and who had, in those very same years, presided over the quiet dismantling of everything the Duchess owned. The contradiction sat at the centre of that house, and it never once resolved. Blackwood's own experience became the strangest evidence of all. She would arrange a visit, travel to Paris, and be told the Duchess was sleeping or too weak, or that today was simply not possible. Come back tomorrow. Tomorrow never came. Years went by like that, a writer circling a house she could not enter, and inside it a woman slipping further out of reach with every cancelled appointment, until the only honest subject left to write about was the wall itself, and the lawyer who had built it. How does one person come to own another's entire existence? On paper, and quietly. As the Duchess's mind failed, the authority to act for her passed, step by step, into the lawyer's hands. Power over the accounts. Power over the medicine and the doctors. Power over who was let in and who was kept out. By the time anyone outside the house understood what had happened, there was no longer a Duchess capable of signing any of it back. The transfer was complete, and in the narrow legal sense, it was entirely proper. That was the horror of it. Nothing had to be broken. The locks did the work. Picture the arrangement itself. Upstairs, in a darkened room, an old woman fed through tubes, unable to form a full sentence, drifting in and out of a mind that no longer held the present hour. Downstairs, in the same walls, a single person now holding total authority over her money, her name, her visitors, and her every remaining day. Whatever you choose to call that, it is not care in any ordinary sense of the word. Blackwood reached for the word imprisonment, and it is hard to find a gentler one that still fits the facts. One by one, the people who had loved her were removed from the picture. Servants who had been with the couple for decades, who had dressed the Duchess and driven the Duke, and kept the whole household turning through all the glittering years, were let go. Old friends who telephoned were told she was not well enough to speak, or were simply never put through. The few who cared enough to travel to Paris and stand on the step were turned away at the door. Look again at that closed door from the very beginning of this story. The sealed shutters. The nurse who admitted almost no one. You now know exactly who was standing behind it, and why. So the grand life narrowed to a single room. The woman who had once been the most photographed guest in the Western world. The name every host in Paris and New York and along the Riviera had fought to seat at their table, ended as a body upstairs, while the whole architecture of her world was rearranged on the floor below. She had spent her long exile as a guest at other people's tables, always invited somewhere, never quite invited home. Now she was not even a guest in her own house. She was its most valuable and most silent possession. And then came the selling. It was later alleged, and Blackwood laid the case out at length, that Bloom quietly sold the Duchess's jewels and possessions, while their owner lay helpless above. Think about what those jewels actually were. Not ornaments. Proof. Stones that a king had gone on, giving her long, after he had given up an empire to keep her. And now, the account goes, they were leaving the house one at a time, valued, catalogued, and carried out to be sold, while the woman whose throat and wrists they had circled lay one floor away and could not say the word no. These were not anonymous baubles either. The Duke had haunted the counters of Cartier for decades, choosing the pieces himself, having them engraved with private words that only the two of them understood. A gold and diamond panther crouched on top of a huge emerald. A flamingo built out of rubies and sapphires, bracelets carrying the couple's own initials and the dates of their smallest anniversaries. Each piece was a sentence in a private language, nearly 40 years of one man saying the same thing over and over in gemstones. And that, the account goes, was what left the house in a valuer's case while she slept. This is the theft the whole story has been moving toward from the very first minute. The woman who had crossed an ocean, walked out of 2 marriages and cost a king the throne of Great Britain, ended her days with strangers, deciding what remained of her, selling the last of it out from under a body that could no longer protest a thing. Everything she had come across the water to keep was carried back down those stairs while she lay above them. If she could even understand that it was happening at all. Here is what that inversion tells you. And it is the whole reason this story is worth the telling. The legend of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor is the great romance of the century, the king who gave up his crown for the woman he loved. That is the image, polished and repeated for 90 years. The reality in that sealed house is an old woman stripped of her jewels, her friends, her voice, and finally her dignity, by someone she had trusted to shield her from exactly this. The gap between those two pictures is about as wide as history gets. When Edward gave up the throne in 1936, he told an empire over the wireless that he could not carry the burden without the help and support of the woman he loved. The woman I love. Half the world wept at the sound of it. 50 years on, the woman he had loved lay unable to speak while the proofs of that love were carried out one by one and turned back into money. No broadcast marked that. No crowd gathered for it. It happened in silence behind drawn shutters, which is precisely how the palace and the lawyer alike seem to prefer their difficulties. And here is the cruelest fold in the whole thing. Out in the world, all through those final years, the name still meant glamour. Wallis Simpson, the divorcée who won a king, the last word in style, the fixture on 1,000 best-dressed lists. That was the picture the public kept and cherished. Almost no one knew that the real Duchess had already disappeared into a bed she could not leave, that the elegance was a memory now maintained by strangers, that the legend was walking around perfectly intact, while the person at its centre had been quietly emptied out. The image outlived the woman by years. It may outlive the truth forever. Look again at the bargain she believed she had struck, a devoted husband, a grand life, security for the years ahead. That was the deal that staff said she thought she had made when she let a king throw a throne down at her feet. It did not merely fail to pay out, it ran backwards. The devoted husband died and left her defenceless. The grand life shrank to one dark room, and the security, the single thing the whole gamble was meant to guarantee, curdled into its exact opposite, a helplessness so complete that a stranger could lift the rings off her own hands, and she would never know they were gone. Remember the 3 letters the family had refused her all those years. Her Royal Highness. The style denied the day she married. The snub aide said the Duke felt like a fresh cut every morning of his life. For 35 years that had been the shape of her exclusion, the small daily reminder that she was in the family and never once of it. And yet, set beside what happened at the end, the palace's coldness begins to look almost like restraint. The family only ever kept her at arm's length. The stranger inside her own front door emptied her out completely. When Wallis Simpson finally died in that house in April 1986, she was 89 years old, and the scandal had outlived nearly everyone who had ever cared enough to take a side in it. The king she married was 14 years in the ground. The courtiers who had withheld the 3 letters were dead. The friends had thinned to almost none, and the last of them had been kept from her door. What remained of the most notorious woman of her age was a frail body in a shuttered room and a set of emptied display cases in the rooms below. If the stories the palace would have preferred you never heard land with you the way this one has, subscribing costs nothing, and there are more of them already lined up and waiting. The bell notification is the part that actually matters. Turn it on, and the next one comes to you instead of vanishing into the feed. Now, the last of it. Decide for yourself whether this was the life she was promised or its precise reverse. Because there was one thing the family finally allowed, the single door they opened after keeping so many shut. Her body was flown out of Paris and back to England. And on a grey day, That April, she was carried to Frogmore, the royal burial ground in the shadow of Windsor Castle, to be laid beside the man she had ruined herself for. Her funeral was small and swift. The Queen attended, the family gathered. The service inside the castle lasted less than half an hour, and the coffin that had once belonged to the most talked-about woman alive was lowered without a single one of the titles she had spent her life being denied. Her stone reads simply, Wallis, Duchess of Windsor, not Her Royal Highness. Even in the earth, the 3 letters stayed withheld. They lie there still. 2 plain slabs of stone side by side under the trees, Edward and Wallis, the Duke and the Duchess of Windsor, together in the private ground of the family that had spent 3.5 decades making sure the 2 of them were never quite together anywhere it counted. No crowd, no crown, just the grass and the wall, and the 2 names cut into the stone. It is a strange kind of mercy, and it is worth sitting with, the nearness to the family that she had been denied in every drawing room, at every table where she was seated as a guest and never once as kin, was granted only when she could no longer feel a thing. She got her place among them at last. She got it as a coffin lowered into their lawn. So go back one final time to that darkened room on the Bois de Boulogne, the shutters drawn tight against the street, the nurse posted at the door, the display cases emptying one by one in the rooms below. That is where the great romance of the century actually ended, not on a throne, and not with a king's confession into a microphone, but with a stranger downstairs counting what the jewels would fetch, the promise she was handed, the devoted husband, the grand life, the security for all the years ahead, never once paid out the way she was told it would. History settled its verdict long ago. Wallis Simpson was the American who took a king and broke a monarchy to do it. But stand for a moment at that closed door, in that sealed and emptied house, with an old woman upstairs who cannot speak and cannot stop any of it, and the question quietly turns itself around. We spent 100 years asking what she cost the crown. Almost no one ever thought to ask what the crown in the end cost her.